China is unlikely to be an exception to this desire to externalize its own values based on its own history and experience. Indeed, in its own way, because of its own longevity and hubristic sense of pride in the legacy of the Middle Kingdom, one might expect this instinct to be very strong. The question I want to pose here is, will the Chinese understand and respect difference? By which I mean primarily ethnic difference, when it is not part of their own culture. We know about the grim white record in this respect, but what will the Chinese be like? There are factors, such as China's own experience of colonialism, which suggest that it might. But the global evidence is not encouraging. All races, even those who have suffered grievous racism, like the Jews, are, it would appear, perfectly capable of behaving in a racist way towards others, as the behavior of Israel illustrates today. There are three reasons to believe that Han Chinese racism, which in an important sense underpins Chinese nationalism, could pose a very serious problem. First, as Chen Guangxing points out in his forthcoming book, Chinese philosophy has traditionally had a powerful racist dimension expressed in the form of Han-centrism. Secondly, the Chinese are understandably proud of their history and culture, but this also often translates into an attitude of superiority. Thirdly, China's long isolation, the splendid isolation of the Middle Kingdom, has inevitably engendered a serious ignorance about the rest of the world. To these points, one might add that there remains a lack of self-reflection about racism amongst the Chinese. It is a subject that is barely discussed. One hopes that this will change. Otherwise, the rise of China is likely to be accompanied by an disturbing Chinese racial chauvinism, especially towards people of darker skin. It is this question, about which there has been so little discussion anywhere, that could be one of, if not the, most disturbing aspect of the rise of China. Which brings me to my third theme, developed and developing country. Hitherto, ever since the onset of industrialization from the late 18th century, the most powerful countries have shared two characteristics. First, they have enjoyed an extremely large gross domestic product. Second, they have also an extremely high GDP per head. The richest nations have also had the richest populations. That has been and remains true of, for example, the United States, the UK, France, Germany and Japan. The only exception, arguably, was the Soviet Union. That situation is about to change. China will not share these two characteristics, but just one, namely the first, a high GDP, which it already has in fact measured by either way, but especially by primary purchasing power, by which it's got the second highest in the world. Let me illustrate this. Here we are. This is in 2003, and China is the second largest economy in the world already by GDP, and by some estimates it's overtaken by this measure the United States in about a decade or so's time. So China was already by that measure the second largest economy in the world. But if you look at the other measure, which is this one here, in other words GDP per head, China is still a very poor country compared to the United States or Japan, or this is the Euro, this is most of the European Union. So this China, in this sense, will be a very new kind of global power, which both at one and the same time is a developed, by virtue of the size of its GDP, is a developed country, and also at the same time a developing country, by virtue of GDP per head. Earlier I referred to the prospect of a partial restoration of the pre-1800 link between population and economic power, broken during the era of Western industrialization and colonialism, as represented by the present rise of China in India. Here we can see another aspect or byproduct of this change. The implications are profound and multifarious. Previously, the distinction between developed and developing countries was clear and unambiguous. Indeed, between 1900 and 1960, there was a fundamental cleavage between those countries that industrialized in the 19th century and those that did not, a situation which persisted until the rise of the Asian tigers in the 1960s. This distinction between developed and developing will in future be more shaded. The continental-sized nation states, namely China and India, are likely to belong to both categories for many decades. Their huge populations will mean that they will continue to embrace very diverse levels of development and living standards within their borders. We're familiar with I won't talk about it, but we're familiar with the huge disparities within China. I mean, in a way, China reflects the picture of globalization within its own ranks. The rich, Beijing, a rich south and eastern seaboard compared with much poorer regions in the western region. The fact that China and India will both be developed and developing countries suggests that they will also enjoy diverse interests, namely the motives and concerns of both developed and developing countries. In effect, they will have a foot in both camps. Hitherto, trade relations have been dominated by the interests of the developed world in opposition to those of the developing world. Where will China and India in future fit in this game? Will they lean towards the developed world or the developing world, or both, depending on the issues involved? It is reasonable to assume that over the next 20 years or so, both will frequently, though not always, make common cause with the developing world. This can already be seen in the cooperation between China, India, Brazil and South Africa in the WTO. China would also share another characteristic with India as a major power. China was partially colonized and India was completely colonized. The club of advanced countries, that is those that commenced their industrialization in the 19th century, or in the case of Britain earlier, were those that did the colonizing. The United States, of course, also started life as a colony, but its circumstances were entirely different. White migrant settlers from Europe, especially Britain. Just as in the case of Australia, Canada and New Zealand, the United States always bore a very different relationship for cultural and racial reasons to the imperial power, namely Britain, both before and after independence. China and India, on the other hand, will be the first major powers that were colonized as non-Western developing countries composed of non-white cultures and races. In other words, China and India have an empathy with the colonial experience, which the imperialist powers obviously do not share. Here is another powerful change in the texture and symbolism of global politics represented by the rise of China, and in this case, especially India. Which brings me to my fourth theme, which is the communist legacy. I'd briefly like to reflect on the meaning and implication of the fact that China has a communist government. Lurking not too far in the background of any discussion about China is the question of its communist government. This is understandable. For almost the whole of the 20th century, what the historian Eric Hobsbawm has described as the short century, namely 1917 to 1989, the world was split into two ideological camps. The dominant discourse of the West was framed by its hostility towards communism. When Soviet communism finally collapsed, it represented an extraordinary victory for the West. Here, then, we have two reasons why there is a stigma attached to China's communist regime, certainly in the West. Namely, the West's anti-communist crusade and then European communism's subsequent failure. But during the same period, almost exactly, that the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, China, governed by a communist party, has been engaged in what is probably the most remarkable economic transformation in human history. Here then we are presented with something of a conundrum. The Soviet Communist Party, ossified, closed and dogmatic,